Hi, and welcome to the Corporate Finance Institute. This is our Excel crash course designed for finance professionals. At CFI, our mission is to help you advance your career. And with that in mind, we've designed an Excel crash course that takes you from start to finish through everything you need to know about Excel to perform world-class financial analysis. Let's review Excel's layout. We're going to quickly talk about the difference between a workbook and a worksheet. We'll look at where cell names are contained, and later in the course we'll learn how to change cell names. Let's understand the formula bar and how to use it, as well as how it can help us find formulas. And then let's explore the ribbon and look at all the various functions contained within the ribbon. First off, when you open a new Excel file, you're creating what's called a workbook. A workbook is the entire file. In the bottom left corner, you have tabs that represent worksheets. You can click the plus arrow to add a new worksheet. You can also change the name of the worksheet by double-clicking on it. The cell name is contained in the top left corner, as highlighted here. In this case, it's cell A1. Later in the course, we'll show you how to change the names of cells, which can be very useful for certain types of financial modeling. To the right of the cell name, we have the formula bar. In the formula bar, we can type in formulas, or we can use the FX function to find a list of formulas or suggestions, or even search for formulas. In this course, we'll review all the key formulas we need, but you may want to search for your own as well. Finally, above that, you've got the ribbon. The ribbon contains an assortment of useful functions that we're going to explore together. We're going to walk through all sections, including home, insert, page layout, formulas, data, review, and view. This is Excel 2016. If you're working in 2013 or 2010, you'll notice almost no difference between 2016, maybe some minor formatting changes. But 2016 will serve as our guide for this course. Let's get going. Please open up a new Excel file, and by doing so you'll create a new workbook. You'll see at the top here, this is labeled Book 1. If you have more than one file open, they'll be labeled 2, 3, 4, etc. In the bottom left corner, you'll see Sheet 1. If you're in cell 2016, the default is to have one worksheet per workbook. In older versions, it's 3. Let's quickly add another worksheet here. And we can change the name of these. Simply double-click on it and type in the new name. Here you'll see that by moving the cursor with the arrow buttons, I'm in cell A1, and the name of it is displayed right here. I can actually change this name, but I won't now. We'll deal with that later. Here's our formula bar. I can type a formula 3 different ways. The first is right in the cell I can type equals sum to start a sum function. Or I can click into the formula bar itself and type equals sum to also start the function. Or thirdly, I can click on the FX insert function here. In the search area I can type sum, and I see that sum comes up, which I can select, and then select the range that I want. So these are the 3 ways to create a formula. Flipping back to our Excel workbook, let's work together here to set up a basic financial analysis. In the top left corner, I'm going to put the units. For example, let's start with USD in thousands. It's helpful to have this in the top corner so that anyone who looks at the model immediately knows what type of units we're dealing with here. I'm going to give a couple columns of space because we're going to be putting financial metric names across some of these rows. And so I'm going to start in column D here and type the first year of historical data that we're going to input. Let's say that we're going to start with 2014. To the right of that, I'm going to type, I can use the plus sign to quickly start a formula. Instead of typing equals, which is a little bit harder to reach, if you're using the number keypad on the right, you can just press the plus sign and select 2014, and then press +1. So now here we've got, and I'm pressing F2 here to see the formula. We've got the previous year +1. I'm going to hold down Shift and press the right arrow, and then Control R to fill that right. So just to do that one more time here quickly, type in 2014. To the right of it, press plus, left arrow, +1, enter, to get 2015. Hold the Shift key and press the right arrow to select the cells to the right and press Control R. This will fill right. So now what we've got here is 2 years of historical data and 5 years of forecast data. What I want to do is label this so that it's easy to understand what's going on here. So I'm going to select, holding down the Shift key and the right arrow, I'm going to select 2014 and 2015, which are the historical periods. I press Control 1 to access the formatting area. And under the number tab here, I'm going to select a custom type of number. What I want to do here is type, I'm going to put a 0 to indicate that it's a regular number, but at the end of the number, I want to put an A, a letter A for actual. This is common convention in finance. Then click OK. So as you'll see here, we've got 2014 and 2015 formatted with an A at the end, so I know that those are historical actual numbers, but they're still treated as numbers in Excel. Then I'm going to select, holding down Control, Shift, and right arrow, the forecast period to the right. By pressing Control 1, I can access Format Cells, go to Custom once again, and this time I'm going to put, in quotes, a capital E at the end to indicate that it's an estimate. And then I'm going to press OK. So now what I've got here is 2 years of actual historical, 5 years of forecasted estimate, and it's very easy to see that these are historical and these are simply estimates. So we've got our numbers in place. What I next want to do here is I want to frame this piece of analysis. I really like to frame things up so they're easy to see. Holding down the Shift key and the right arrow, I can select this entire area. What I want to do is put a bold, dark background behind it and change the lettering to be white. So to do that, I'm going to, practicing my shortcuts here, I'm going to press Alt, H for the home screen, and H for the background color. Using the arrow keys, I can move across here and select something that I think looks good. I'm going to go with this very dark blue here. It's almost bordering on black. And then I'm going to press Enter. Now obviously I can't see the font very well, so the next thing I'm going to do is press Alt-H and FC for font color, and I want to make it white. I think this really pops the header out, and in fact what I might do next is selecting the years, press Control-B to bold them. Taking this one step further, I'm going to press Control-1 again so that I get into the type of number that it is. Select font, and I'm going to make it size 14. I think this really makes the numbers pop out at the top, and I can quickly see wherever I am in this sheet what year we're in. Now you'll notice that these cells are starting to look a little bit crowded. So let's hold down the Shift key and the right arrow, and then press Control Spacebar. Control Spacebar helps us automatically select the columns. Because what I want to do here is actually adjust the column width. And in order to do that, I'm going to press Alt, and then H for home, and O for format, and W for column width. So the default is set here, but I'm going to increase this to 12 and press Enter. I think now that gives us a nice column width where we can easily fit several numbers in this cell. The next thing that I'm going to do is that you'll notice there's a dotted line that's appeared here. That means if I were to print this page on the current settings, I would actually miss 2 of these columns. So what we should do here is using our shortcuts again, press Alt, P for page layout, and O for orientation. So I'm actually going to change this to be a landscape. I think landscape works better for financial models, typically when there's several years that are going out to the right. So now we have it all fitting in one page. We've got several spaces and we've got some quite bold headings here. But you'll notice now, if I start to scroll down, I quickly can't tell what year it is that I'm referencing if I'm in a cell down here. This can become quite challenging when a model gets big, as you always want to know what year you're referencing. So what I recommend doing is putting your cursor at the leftmost cell in row 2. And what we're going to do here is freeze panes. In order to freeze the pane, I'm going to press Alt. I'm going to press W for view, and then F for freeze panes. And F one more time to freeze panes. So now if I scroll down, you'll notice that I can always see what year is across the top. I think this is really important for setting up a good piece of financial analysis. It'll make your life a lot easier. The next thing that I'm going to do is create a category heading here. So I'm going to create an income statement and press enter. I'm going to bold it by pressing Control B. And let's just quickly enter a very basic income statement here. We're going to input revenue, cost of goods sold, which will give us gross profit, and then we're going to deduct our SG&A expenses, which will allow us to arrive at EBITDA. We'll then deduct depreciation and interest, which will give us earnings before tax. We'll then calculate our taxes, and finally our net income. So this is going to be our simplified income statement here over on the left. Now that we have a basic income statement set up for financial analysis, let's put some numbers in place. Pressing Control and Page down allows you to move between tabs. So Control Page down to move over to Research, Control Page up to move back to Financial Analysis. So if you've downloaded the Excel file that I included at the beginning of this course, please press Control Page down where you'll see some data here that you can copy over. Using Control and Shift, holding them both down, then press the right arrow and the down arrow to quickly select the entire set. Press Control C to copy, and then press Control Page up to move back over here. This is where I'm going to teach you how to paste special. There are many different ways to paste in Excel. And if I'm just clicking on it quickly here, you can see that Paste Special is an option. Now there is a shortcut, but I've just used the mouse to bring it up here. There are all sorts of different ways to paste here. You can paste as formulas, values. You can copy and paste just the formatting, not the numbers. You can also multiply or divide by a certain number that you've copied. So for example, you can copy the number 1,000 and then click multiply and multiply everything else by 1,000 or divide by 1,000. You can also transpose, which takes a vertical list of numbers and pastes them horizontally, or it takes a horizontal list and pastes it vertically. So in this case, we're going to paste as values because I don't want to copy over any formulas or formatting or anything else that might be associated with the numbers we just copied. So now I've got them pasted here. The first thing that I'm going to do here is basic formatting. I'm going to press Control 1, and I'm going to change the type of number here from general to a number with a comma and 1 decimal place. I'm also going to select that the negative number will be in parentheses. This is the most common in financial analysis. Then press OK. So now we've got some more nicely formatted numbers here. But there's more we can do on the formatting side, and we're gonna make this a little more dynamic too. So right now all of these are hard-coded numbers. But I know that things like gross profit, EBITDA, EBIT, and net income can all be sum functions or difference functions. So what I'm going to do is delete the gross profit, delete the EBITDA, the earnings before tax, and the net income. So what I've simulated here is if you were to copy over some financial data that was sent to you, historical financial data, this is what you would do. You would paste all the numbers in, delete the subtotals so we can make things a little more dynamic here. So what I'm going to do for gross profit is set it equal to revenue minus cost of goods sold. Then what I do is holding down the Shift key and pressing the right arrow, I can select the cell to the right and press Control R to fill it right. Next, I want to calculate EBITDA. EBITDA is going to be my gross profit less my SG&A. And once again, I'm going to select the cell to the right and press Control R. If I press F2, I can quickly check the formula. Next is earnings before tax, which I'm going to set equal to EBITDA less the sum of these two items here, depreciation and interest. Close bracket and press Enter. I can then, holding Shift and the right arrow, select the cell to the right and press Control R. And finally, I can calculate my net income, being the earnings before taxes less the taxes. And I will also fill that right. So now what I've got is a little bit more of a dynamic income statement where I have these subtotals here that will all automatically update if I make changes to any of the inputs. But if you look at this, it's not very clear what's an input and what's a formula. So this is where we're going to start to use some formatting to make it much easier to understand. We're going to make all hard-coded numbers in blue and leave formulas in black. So what I'm going to do is select these four here that are all hard codes. I'm then going to go and press Alt-H and FC to get into font color. Now I'm actually going to press M for more colors because there is a specific blue that I like to use, which is this right here, and it's actually from an older version of Excel. It's very common to use this particular shade of blue in financial analysis as it's very easy to identify. When I press OK here, this blue really stands out. It's very easy to see relative to the black. So I'm going to do that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to copy and paste special again, but this time paste just the formatting. So I'm going to select just one cell here that has the proper formatting for hardcodes by pressing Control C. Then what I'm going to do is scroll down to the cells that I want to apply the formatting to and select them. Then I'm going to press the shortcuts Alt, H for home, V for paste, S for special, and then in this area here I want to select formats, and I can see that the T is underlined, so I'm going to select T and press Enter. As you'll see, what I've done here is I've simply copied down the formatting and not the numbers. Now because I haven't pressed Escape or Enter yet again, you can see that this number here still has this revolving green border around it. As long as that's happening, I can now quickly copy the last action that I did and speed up formatting a lot here. So I want to apply to depreciation and interest the same formatting. If I select those cells and press F4, I can repeat the action. If I select taxes as well and press just F4, I can repeat the action again. Now I'll hit Escape. So as you'll see here, we can go back and using F2, we can quickly audit and review that all these black cells are formulas, all the blue ones are hard codes, and we've got a more dynamic income statement in place. Now that we have our historical data in place, let's do a very basic forecast so we can see how to set this up properly with formatting and formulas. So I'm going to start a new subheading here for assumptions. And I'm going to bold it. And I'm going to want to understand what revenue growth is going to be. So I'm going to put revenue growth. I want to understand what cost of goods sold is as a percent of revenue. I'll want to put in SG&A as a dollar forecast. I'll want to put in depreciation as a percent of sales in this case, or percent of revenue, as a very, very simplistic way of forecasting depreciation. In our financial modeling courses, we will go into much more detail of how to forecast depreciation properly. Interest in this case will just be in dollars. I'll want to know the tax rate. So with these assumptions here, I'll be able to forecast the income statement going forward. The first thing I'm going to do here now is calculate the historical revenue growth rate. So I'm going to set it equal to the 2015 revenue divided by the 2014 revenue minus 1. And I'm going to press Alt-H-P to quickly make that a percent. And if I want to add a decimal point to it, I can press Alt-H0. Alt-H0 adds decimal places. Alt-H9 removes decimal places. I'm going to leave it at 1 decimal place. I can only calculate it for 2015. As in 2014, I obviously don't have a prior period to compare it to. For cost of goods sold, I'm going to take that divided by revenue and press Alt-H-P again and Alt-H0 to calculate cost of goods sold as a percent of revenue. Holding Shift and pressing right arrow, I can fill it right with Control R. Next, I'm going to reference SG&A, and I'm just going to reference it as a dollar value. So I'm just going to set it equal to that cell and then press Control R to fill it right. Depreciation, I want to calculate as a percentage of revenue. So I take depreciation and divide it by revenue. I then press Alt-H-P to make it a percentage and Alt-H0 to add a decimal place. Interest will be a direct reference to the dollar values. And tax rate will be taxes divided by earnings before tax. I press Alt-H-P and Alt-H0 to make it a percentage. I then select these cells using using the Shift and down arrow and the right arrow and pressing Control R. So I now have in place all of the historical assumptions that will influence what I want to use as the forecast assumptions. I'm going to make this very straightforward and just make the forecast more or less equal to the historical numbers. So we can start with revenue growth and make it 10%. Cost of goods sold, I'm going to keep constant at 45%. SG&A, I will step up a little bit to a rounder number of 20 million. Depreciation, I will round up to 5%. Interest, I'll keep constant at 1 million. And taxes, I'll keep constant at 30%. So what I'm going to do now is format this number using Alt-H-P for percentage and Alt-H0 to add a decimal place. And then press Alt-FC, Alt-H-FC to grab the blue font color, which I can copy and paste special using Alt-H-V, S for special, T for formats. I can go down to this number here and press F4 to repeat, and tax rate F4 to repeat again. On these next two cells, I'm also going to copy and then paste special, Alt-H, VST, and I'm going to repeat that using F4 down here. And I actually am going to also make it a blue font color, so that's Alt-H, FC, Alt-H, FC. So I've now got my forecast assumptions in place, and since I'm just going to straight line this forecast, we can select these, holding Shift and the down arrow, still holding Shift, press the right arrow to get to 2020, and press Control R. So I now have a straight line forecast here with no changes to the assumptions. We're just focusing on the formatting and structure here. Now that we have our forecast assumptions in place, let's move up to the top of the income statement and start filling out the forecast. We're going to set the first year of forecast equal to the historical year times 1 plus, and if I press Control and the down arrow, I quickly jump to revenue growth, where I can close bracket. The formatting here is not correct, so what I'm going to do is copy this cell here, which is the formatting I want to borrow and apply to the entire forecast area. So I select the area and I press Alt-H, V, S, T, enter. The entire forecast area is all formulas, so it's all going to be black. Next, I'm going to forecast cost of goods sold as being revenue times, and I press Control down and then down arrow one more time, percent of revenue. Gross profit, I can copy over using Control R. SG&A can be a straight link down, pressing Control and the down arrow to then select SG&A. EBITDA can be copied over with Control R. Depreciation will be a percent of revenue, so revenue multiplied by the appropriate percentage. And you'll notice here that I'm using Control and the up and down arrows to quickly move around the sheet. So interest equal to Control down arrow again brings me to the bottom of the assumptions, and then up arrow once. Earnings before tax, I select and fill right with Control R. Taxes is equal to earnings before tax multiplied by, and then I'm going to press Control down once, Control down twice to jump all the way to the bottom. And net income, I can copy across with Control R. So I've now got the entire income statement forecast here for 2016. In order to fill in the rest of the table, press Control and Shift as well as the down arrow to select the entire year. Let go of Control and just holding Shift and the right arrow, select the area to the right. Now press Control R to fill it right. As you can see, this allows us to build a forecast very quickly in a very organized and logical way. So we've now got all of our drivers in place down here, all of the formulas copied across here. We can use F2 to quickly audit a few of these cells and make sure they're linked up correctly. So I'm just sort of picking some random spots here and making sure that yes, these formulas are what they're supposed to be. This is really just for sanity and confidence building more than anything else. The next thing I'm going to do is a little bit of formatting. So I think it's nice to bold the revenue line at the top and bold the net income line at the bottom. So I'm using Control, Shift, and right arrow to select these areas, and then I'm using Control B to bold. The next thing I'm going to do is add in a few borders. I think putting a border above a subtotal is a nice way to group Excel work. So let's select a gross profit here and then press Alt-H, B for border, P for top. So as you can see, I've got a line here at the gross profit subtotal. Let's do the same with EBITDA, Alt-H, BP. Earnings before tax, Alt-H, BP. And with net income, let's do a slightly different one. Let's do Alt H, B, and U, which does a top and bottom line. The next thing we're going to do here is remove the grid lines so we can really see the nice formatting. In order to do that, let's use the shortcuts Alt, W, VG, and as you can see, we've now got a clean sheet here with no grid lines. Basic formulas and functions. Now that we have the layout and structuring under our belt, let's take a look at formulas and functions that will improve the sophistication of our model. They're a very important part of financial model building. They make models more dynamic and sophisticated, and they add detail and precision. The key is to balance not getting overly complicated with providing a high level of accuracy and detail. Overall, we want to have a simple model, but we want to use intelligent functions and formulas to get us a very detailed solution. These functions and formulas that we're going to discuss in this section are specifically designed for financial analysis and financial modeling. By learning all of the formulas that we teach you here, you'll be able to build world-class financial models and stand out from the crowd. Now, let's get going. Alright, the first thing we're going to cover on the functions and formulas part of this course is dates and time periods. Let's scroll down. I'm in the Basic Financial Analysis tab. Let's scroll down to a new area here, and let's assume we're going to perform some analysis that requires specific dates. So I'm just going to create a header here that is time periods. I'm going to bold that, and then I'm going to create a line here for monthly data. I'm going to create one here for annual data. And I'm going to show you a few things here. The first thing is we're going to learn how to make today's date. And so you can set equal to today, and then just open and close parentheses, and you get today's date. If you press Control 1, you're going to want to go into the number format and make sure that it's set to be a date. So this can be useful if you want to have today's date in the Excel file as a starting period. It's important to note, though, that this will automatically update each day when you open the file, so it will change over time. If, however, you wanted to have it be static so that every time you open the file it has the same start date, I'm going to press Control 1 here to change this to a date. Then I would recommend hard coding it and using Alt-H-F-C, changing the color to be blue so we know that it's a hard code. So now I've got two versions of today's date. I've got a dynamic version and a static version. So let's look at some monthly data now. If I want to imagine that these numbers were monthly instead of annual, what I can do here is I can use a formula that's for the end of the month. So it's EOMONTH. And I'm going to select a start date, and in this case I'm not going to add a time period to the end, an increment. I'm just going to take the end of the month, which happens to be today, and then so let's just put in a different start date here to make it more interesting. Let's say it was August 15th, 2016. So it automatically takes that to the end of the month. Now what we can do is across the top here, I'm going to add increments that we want to increase the monthly numbers by. And I'm going to fill that right with Control R. So across the top here you can see this is sort of month 0, and then you have month 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what we can do now is we can make a similar formula that's dynamic that moves across. So I'm going to set it to be equal to the end of month function. I'm going to select the start date as our hard-coded number in D23. I'm going to lock it using F4 so that it's an absolute reference, comma, and then I'm going to reference the cell above, which is the number of months out that I want to move it, and I'm going to close bracket. So now I get it moving from August 31st to September 30th. I'm going to select the area to the right and press Control R, and then I see that it moves September, October, November, December, etc. And it's always picking, you can see February 28th is always automatically updating for the last day of the month. So this can be very powerful if you have a monthly forecast and you want to be accurate and detailed about what time period you're referencing. So now I'm going to show you how to do annual data where you're going to pick the last day of the year as the time period instead of the last day of the month. And we can set it up to make this dynamic, which can be very useful. So the first thing that I'm going to do actually is I'm just going to move the absolute reference date of today over 1. And the reason I'm going to do that is I'm going to put a 0 here and change this formula to be 0 plus 1 and move it across. So now what we can do is copy cell E24 and paste it in D24. So we've now got a 0 month as our start, which is the end of the month that our current date that we've put in here is. So now what we can do is we can do the annual version of this. Let's set this equal to date. The date function just returns a date in Excel. And within the date function, we're going to also use the year function. Year function will take a date and turn it into whatever year that date is. So in this case, we just want to take the 2016 portion of that date. And then we're gonna add to it a time period. So we're gonna add to it either in this case 0 years or 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, etc. And then we're gonna set the format to be the month is always going to be December and the date is always going to be the 31st. And the last thing that we're going to do in this formula, going back into it with F2, is we're going to lock the reference to C23 so that when we copy this formula over, it copies over properly. So we've got the December 31st, 2016 being the date here, and then I'm going to select this area and press Control R, and you can see now that it goes 2016, 17, 18, 19, etc. So we've got these dynamic end of year dates based on a start date. And if I were to change this to 2020, as you can see, all these dates automatically update, the monthly and the annual. And you can build this into your header dates at the top, or you may use it for a separate piece of analysis down, like I've shown you down here. But in any event, you're going to want to have it dynamic so that you can always input a start date and you can add increments to it, and the model will always be up to date. The last function I'm going to show you how to use is called year_frac, which represents a fraction of a year. And this can be very important for discounting and DCF analysis when you need to know what time period you're discounting, whether it's half of a year at the beginning, 3/4 of a year, etc., etc. So what we can do actually is let's make another section here that says monthly period, and then annual period. And what I'm going to do is for the monthly, I'm going to type equals year_frac, open bracket. The start date is always going to be this one hard-coded start date, so I'm going to press F4. And the end date is going to be whatever the current month that I'm looking at is. And I'm going to close bracket. I can take that and fill it right. So as you can see, we're building up over time. Each month is representing a small fraction of a year. So this can be very powerful for discounting. And then with the annual, I'm going to do the same. Equals year_frac, open bracket. Absolute reference this cell by pressing F4. And then select the end of year end date. And fill it right. So as you'll see, all these time periods, because we're starting on August 15th, 2016, you're moving along an entire year in each case, but you've always got this fraction, this sort of stub year, if you will, of 0.37. So this can be useful for discounting. Let's just clean this up a bit. If you press Control Shift down arrow and then right arrow, you can then press Alt H9 a few times to just reduce the number of decimal places. I think 2 decimal places is sufficient in this case to clean it up. Let's take a look at sum, average, and sum product functions. These can be very useful for performing analysis. Let's assume that we want to analyze the costs of this business. So what I'm going to do is down below here, let's create a little header called cost analysis. I'm going to bold that. And I'm going to scroll up and copy, I want cost of goods sold. I'm going to hold down control here. SG&A, depreciation, interest, and taxes. I'm going to copy those and paste them here. So what I want to do is I'm going to link each of these up. So for COGS, I'm going to scroll up, select that, SG&A, depreciation, interest, and finally taxes. And then below that I'm going to write total. So the first thing that we can do is we can practice filling right. Press Control Shift down to select the entire area. Let go of Control and just holding Shift, use the right arrows, and press Control R. Now, the first thing I want to show you how to do is a quick auto sum. Auto sum is a very fast way to sum a group of cells, and it's just Alt =. So I'm going to do that one more time. On your keyboard, press Alt and then equals, and enter, and you'll automatically sum, and then you can fill that right. So I'm pressing F2 here to look at these formulas, a very fast way to auto sum. So the next thing we can do is let's compare the total to an average. Let's type average here, and then we're going to use the function equals average, open bracket, and select the entire list of expenses. And we're going to fill that right. So as you can see, we just quickly took a simple average of the group. The next thing that we can do is we can look at exploring the idea of a weighted average or a sum product. Now, this is just sort of dummy data in this example, but you might want to weight things based on some sort of criteria. Now, in this case, you could take, for example, you could type some weightings here. And let's just pick some random numbers, and I'm going to put 0 weighting on the taxes. And then what I could do is take a weighted average, and to do that I'm going to use the sum product function. Sum product multiplies out 2 arrays, and it sort of moves across the top, so it multiplies 10 by 67 million, 10 by 16, etc., all the way down, so it'll apply 0 weighting to this one here. And then we divide by the total to get the weighted average. So the first thing we're going to do is take this array, and then we're going to weight it against this array, which I'm going to lock in place with F4, because we're always going to be referencing those. And then I'm going to close bracket. So first I'll just take the sum product of all those, and I won't divide by the total. And let's do some formatting. Control C, Alt H, V, S, T. So as you can see, you get a much bigger number because we've multiplied these numbers out. And if I go here below the weightings and I use my Alt equals shortcut to quickly sum that, what I'm going to have to do here is divide this by and I'm pressing F2 to move around with the cursor, divided by 30. And then I can see in this case, when I created a weighted average, it was 29 million instead of 21 million. And now, I mean, it's kind of a silly number because we're just weighting expenses randomly, but the point here is to see how you would do a weighted average based on some criteria. And if I press F2 in here one more time, I'm also going to need to anchor cell C36 to be an absolute reference by pressing F4. So go ahead and press F4 there, and then this formula can be filled right. And as you'll see, I'm always using these same weightings right here and applying these weightings to all these various costs and then dividing them by the total of the weightings. So I can see here I've got an average and then I've got a weighted average. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is how to let's add a median as well. And it's quite simple in Excel. It's just the median function. And again, I'm going to select all the expenses, close bracket, and I see that SG&A 16.5 million. That's the median of the group. So another piece of statistical analysis that you can use here. And so you've got an average, a weighted average, and a median, and a total. And one last thing to clean this up for best practices. These are all hard codes here. So let's press Alt-H, F-C, and make them blue. This is a formula here. Everything else is a formula, a reference to another cell, or a function. So we're in good shape in terms of formatting here. Let's continue building our analysis down below here and start using some if statements. If statements are very powerful in financial modeling and used very frequently. So there's a bunch of different ways to use them. And I'm going to walk through some examples with you now. Let's first off, let's take a look at these periods. And let's use some if statements around these periods. The first thing I want to know is for the annual period. If it's less than a full year, I want to flag it as a stub year. And if it's, as long as it's a year or more, then I'm just going to call it like a normal year or something like that. So let's put our cursor right below annual period. Then let's practice inserting a row. So let's press Alt H, I for insert, and R for row. And then I'm going to put here stub or full year. And let's practice a very basic if statement here. Let's say if, open bracket, if, and then we're going to have a logical test, a value if true, and a value if false. So the logical test is if the number in this cell here is less than 1, meaning it's less than a full year, then I want to return in quotation marks stub, close quotes. Otherwise, I want to say full year, close quote, and close bracket. So what you can see here is that because this is less than 1, it's just returned the word stub. Let's practice aligning right here. So let's press Alt H, AR for align right. And I'm going to hold down Shift and the right arrow and press Control R to fill this right. And we see that it's working. So we've got a stub year in the first period, and then we've got full years thereafter. So this is a way to use an if statement to do a logical test and then return a string of text. Let's look at another example down below where instead of returning a string of text, we're going to return a number. So let's say that we want to know which years have total operating expenses that are greater than 150,000. So let's say we only want to highlight those years. Otherwise, we want zeros. So let's put here And what I want to do is I want to put down here if less than 150,000. And I'm actually going to type that number here to make this dynamic. And then I'm going to copy this and paste it below, and then I'm going to say if greater than or equal to 150,000. I'm going to select these and pressing Alt-H, F-C, make them this shade of blue. So now what I can do is I can make a formula that says if, open bracket, if the total expenses, if the total expenses are less than this number here, which I'm going to lock in place with F4, then I want you to return that value of the total expenses. Otherwise, I want you to return nothing. So in this case, you see that this is indeed below 150,000, and so we return the value. If I select this and fill it to the right, you see what happens here is that as soon as it crosses over to 150,000, we return the value 0. Now let's do the second example. This time we're going to say if the total operating expenses are greater than or equal to, and I've set it greater than or equal to so that we capture the instance where expenses might be exactly 150,000. If we only did the first line as less than and the second line as greater than, we would actually miss the instance where it might be 150,000 evenly. So I've said greater than or equal to, and then I've said if it is greater than or equal to, I want you to return the number. Otherwise, I want you to return 0. So in these first years, we should have 0. And let's just go back into this formula and make sure we've done our locking properly. So we know that we need to lock C45 because we're always going to be referencing relative to that number. And the other parts of this formula we want to be dynamic. So let's try copying that right and see if that works. And great, we see that in these earlier years, we're always less than 150,000, and then we switch over. And we can see that these two if statements are working correctly because we're just highlighting on the first row only they should be less than 150, and on the second row they should be greater than. So this is a powerful way to do some if analysis, and I'm going to just format these quickly to be the same as everywhere else in the model. So I copied and I'm going to paste special. Some formatting. And there we go. We've got another use of the if statement. So we've got an if statement that's returning some words here. We've got an if statement that is returning a value, a number, or a 0. And let's work through a couple other examples of using if statements. Another use of if statements is for error checking and ensuring the model is working properly. So let's do an error check here. And what I want to do is, and actually I'm gonna copy this and move it down because I'm going to add an extra line here that just says total expenses. And on this line here, I'm going to use Alt equals to do our quick auto sum. I'm going to take the total of these two rows and fill it right. And essentially what I want to do is make sure that for some reason I'm not double counting here, that this formula is not double referencing the total expenses. So what I would do is I would say here if the total expenses in this line equals the total expenses in this line, then let's say okay. So we're error free. Otherwise, say error. And then close bracket. I can press Alt H and AR to align right, and then I can fill this right. So I can see that we're okay here. There's no double counting of expenses with these greater than or less than functions. But just in case, let's just type an example to see what would happen if even this was off by $1. All of a sudden, I've got an error message there. So we can see that this is working properly. I'm going to undo that with Control Z. So now we've got an error check here. It's very common to use this on the balance sheet to make sure that assets equals liabilities plus shareholders' equity. You might want to set up this OK or error function to make sure that they're balancing correctly. And one final thing that I'm going to show you how to do, we've covered it earlier in the course, but just to review and make this extra dynamic, let's adjust these labels here so that if I change this number here to be 170,000 instead of 150, it's actually going to update in the label here. So to do that, press F2 and using Control and the left arrow, get to the beginning of the string of text. Now we're going to change it to a formula. So it's going to be equals, and I'm going to open quote. Now we're going to change it to a formula. So it's going to be equals, and I'm going to open quote. If less than, and then I'm going to close the quote here. I'm going to delete the 150,000 that I've typed in as a hard code, and I'm going to put an ampersand, and then pressing F2 to get out and move the cursor, I'm going to select this number here. So now it says it's the same as before, except when I change this, so let's say I change this to be 180,000, it's actually updated in my formula here, and I can now see that I've got some issues here because that's actually triggered an error here where I'm double counting expenses. So I'm going to change this back to 150,000, and I'm going to make this dynamic as well by pressing F2, going back to the beginning of the string of text, setting it equal to a formula where I open quote, then I close quote, delete the text, use an ampersand, and pressing F2 to get out and move the cursor, I select cell C46. So now we've got this totally dynamic, and if I want to go one step further to avoid double counting, I'm actually going to set this number here to be equal to the number above, and then I'm going to change it to be black because it's now a formula. What that means is that if I change this number, I can't inadvertently double count like it was earlier. So that actually changes the way this analysis is performed. So I always want to just capture the expenses once. So now I've got a dynamic setup here where the labels are changing and all these functions are changing, and I'm always in an error-free situation because I've made it more dynamic. So a few more examples here of how you can use if and dynamic headers to create powerful analysis. Let's take a look at how to incorporate rounding and absolute references in our analysis. The first thing we're going to do is take a look at rounding with decimal places. So if I take these numbers up here, and let's select this entire section with Control, Shift, down, and right arrows, and using Alt H0, we can add decimal places. So what we'll see here is that particularly in this weighted average section, we have a lot of decimals here. Let's take a look at how we can use the round function to change the number of decimal places. So first off, if I want to round off the weighted average, in the first case, I want to have it to, let's say, 4 decimal places. Well, I see that I get the same numbers up above because that is only showing 4 decimal places. Now, if I want to change that to be 3 decimal places, you can see that the last number is rounded off to 0. We can also make it 2 decimal places. Let's make it 1 decimal place. And finally, you can actually make this a 0 as well. So showing to no decimal places. So this can be very useful if you want to show a long string of decimals but round them off, or if you just want the numbers to be rounded in the background for calculations, actually, for math. So that's a very useful way to adjust the number of decimal places. But what if you don't want to show something with decimal places? What if you actually want to round before the decimal? So let's take a look at how to do that. And I'm just going to remove some of the decimal places here to go back to our original formatting. So this is 29,677. And let's think about how we could round this. You know, you might want to round this all the way up to the nearest thousand. So it might actually just become 29,000 even. Let's look at how to do that. So this function is called mRound, and m just stands for multiple. So we're going to round this number here to the nearest thousand. So just type in 1,000 and close bracket. So now it's 29,000. We could round it to the nearest 100. We could round it to the nearest 10. Or we could round it to the nearest dollar, which is the same as when we did the decimal places to 0 with the regular round function. So they overlap at this point. And we could also make it even. Let's go bigger and say to the nearest. If we went as big as the nearest 100,000, then you see we'd get 0, of course, because it rounds it all the way down. So depending on what you want, if the nearest 10,000, then we get 30,000 as an output. So this can be very useful if you want to take some numbers and make them round for either output or for calculation purposes. If I take this number and multiply it by 10, you can see that I get 300,000, which is very different than if I take this number and multiply it by 10. So you can actually see how you would use this to change the way math flows through in a model if you wanted to be rounding every step of the way. It could be very powerful, and it could also be used just for output in terms of formatting. So this is some very useful analysis that we can do. And one other function that I want to show you is the absolute function. So let's suppose, for example, that I was showing my expenses as negative numbers, which is common practice in a lot of cases. Or for example, I had a cash balance or some other number that went negative. In my calculations, I may want to have an absolute reference so that I want this number to be shown as a positive. So I can use the absolute function to do that. And in some later examples, we're going to use the absolute function where we want to show in sensitivity analysis the plus and minus impact of a change from an assumption. We're going to use absolute function to align that, and I'll show you a bit later. So absolute is also a powerful tool. So I'm just going to change these back to be one decimal place using Alt H9. So now our formatting is right back in place. In this chapter, we're going to cover off min, max, as well as large and small functions. And these are all very powerful tools for performing analysis. So first of all, let's just type here min, max, and then I'm going to leave a space and put small, large. So these can be very powerful ways to analyze data. So the first thing I want to do is type in min, and I want to take the minimum of all of the expenses that I've laid out here. I want to find out what's the minimum expense line on the income statement. And I see here that it's 1,000. And then I'm also going to type here max and scroll up to the expense lines and select each line of expenses, and I can see that the max is 67. So I can copy these across and see how they change over time. So the minimum is not changing. It's the interest expense, which is fixed, and then the maximum. If I scroll up here, I can see that it is cost of goods sold. So that's all well and good and fairly straightforward. But a lot of times it's helpful to say what is the second largest or second smallest or third largest, third smallest. So we can use the small and large functions. And what I'm going to do here is just type two numbers that will be our inputs. And I'm going to change them to be blue colored. So Alt-H, FC, and then select that blue there. And what I'm going to do then is in this function, I'm going to say equals small. I'm going to select the expenses in the same way that I did with the min and max functions, except this time I'm going to add a comma, and I'm going to select an absolute reference, locking with 8.4, to this cell here. So in this case, it's picking the very smallest one, which is the same as the min. So in this case, there's no difference. But what happens if I want to see the second smallest, or third smallest, fourth smallest, fifth smallest, etc.? So here you can see that this is actually small and large are actually much more interesting and powerful functions than min and max, and they can be used as min and max functions if you use 1 in the place of the ranking of smallest or largest. So this is a great tool, and let's link up large as well. So we're just going to link up to the same area as before, all the expense lines, and then we're going to add a comma, and we're going to select this cell here, C54, as an absolute reference by pressing F4 and then close bracket. So again, this is the same as the max function. You can see that these two numbers are equal to each other. But then I can see what the second largest expense is. And if I scroll up, it looks to be accurate that taxes are the second largest expense. And then the third largest, I can see that right here as being SG&A. So a very powerful tool here if I want to take, say, the second smallest and the second largest. And what I'm going to do is copy and then paste some formatting down here. And I'm going to fill this to the right. So now I've got a very dynamic piece of analysis where I can rank first, second, third, largest, and smallest. And we're going to find this very useful later on in our sensitivity analysis. So the min and max are certainly useful, and if you know you're only going to ever want to look at the minimum or maximum in a range, then I suggest using those. But if you want to be more dynamic, I suggest using small or large, pretty much, always even in replace of min and max, because as I pointed out, you can actually just put a 1 there and it's the same as min and max. Let's take a look at how to avoid errors in Excel that may mess with the rest of our financial model. So we're going to use if error as a powerful way to avoid errors. So let's say, for example, that I've got a hard-coded number here, and for whatever reason it happens to be 0, and I'm taking some other numbers here, like for example the largest expense on our income statement, and I'm dividing it by 0, and I'm gonna lock that in place with F4, the 0, and copy it across, and I get a whole bunch of errors. But if I change this to a 1 or a 2 or a 3, it works. And there may be some situations where 0 only applies to part of the analysis, or you may actually want to be able to enter it. So what we can do here is change this to say equals if error, open bracket. And so we have the function here that we want to calculate. So we want to put a comma to say, so if the result of that calculation is an error, then what should we output? And in this case, let's just say NA in quotes here, and then press enter. And if I use Alt-H-A-R to align right, I have that aligning right. Control Shift and right arrow highlights everything, and I press Control R. So now what happens is, if it's a 1 or a 2, it's fine, and if it's a 0, it just says NA, so I don't get an error message. This can be really useful because there may be down here other functions that are dependent on that number, and I don't want them to necessarily all ref out. So in this case, I get a different type of error message than I got in the one above. So I could also change this to say if error, and I'm going to take this here, put a comma, and then this time I want to change it to a 0 instead of an NA. If I change it to be a 0 instead of an NA, and let's see what happens as I toggle this. Okay, so now what's happening is I can actually continue to build the function, even though I've got an error message that would normally be displayed here and here. I can actually continue to let my model flow through. So this is a very powerful way to not have one error message that might occur here or here impact the financial model down here. So what I'm able to do is just continue building, and I'm not being impacted by what would actually be an error up above. So when it's a 1, these functions would work fine. But if I change this to a 0 and I didn't have the if error messages here, then none of these calculations down here would work. So this is a very powerful way to avoid errors that screw up your entire model. Now the last thing I'm going to do here is just label these rows so we know what's going on here, and I'm gonna just label them as one is dividing by 0 and the other is adding with an error, and then these are also examples of adding with errors. So essentially what you've got now is a clean layout of our financial model. The next thing I'm going to show you how to do is use find and replace to edit formulas. So the find and replace function in Excel is very powerful. If you press Control F, we can do a simple example where we're just going to change text. So let's say, for example, I want to find USD, which I know is in the top left corner here, and it may be in other places throughout the model. But what I want to do is replace USD with CAD. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to then select Replace All. And it tells me that there was just one spot in the model that had it. It was the top left corner. We change it to CAD. I'm going to close that and then just press Control Z to leave it in USD. So that's fine and relatively straightforward, but it's much more interesting to use find and replace to edit formulas. So one thing we can do is that if I want to change this NA here to be something else, I could go into the actual formula itself and change NA. The other thing that I could do that would probably be faster is I could press Control F and I could find NA, and Excel is going to look in the formulas and then replace it with not applicable, and I can replace all, and it tells me that it happened 8 times. So now I actually have not applicable here. I'm going to Control Z, undo that. But you can see how you're starting to get into the formulas. So let's also imagine that I want to change a reference of a cell. So if in these large and small functions here, I want to now instead of referencing cell C53 in the case of small, I actually want to reference B53. I could select this area here. So now I'm doing find and replace within a selection. If I don't have a selection, I'm just in one cell, it will find and replace for the whole sheet. If I have a selection, I can press Control F. What I want to do is I want to look for C53, which has $ around it locking in place, and I want to replace that with B53. And then I'm going to press Replace All, and I can see that there were 7 replacements here. So now it's actually referencing B53 instead of C53 as it was earlier. And this was a very simple and straightforward example, but you can imagine how with a much bigger spreadsheet, you may want to start adjusting formulas, and it may be easier to use find and replace to actually change a lot of formulas all at once. So find and replace is a very powerful form of model editing. Now it's time to keep practicing. The key to being proficient at Excel is a lot of practice and experience. We've got several courses at CFI that will help you take your Excel skills to the next level now that you've got the foundations. The first three that are critical are Financial Modeling Fundamentals, Building a Financial Model in Excel, and then FP&A Rolling Cash Flow Forecast. Once you've worked your way through those, you may want to try some more advanced courses like our Startup or E-commerce Financial Modeling course, Mining Financial Modeling, and Sensitivity Analysis. These courses will take you to a professional level of financial modeling and Excel use. Thanks so much for taking this course with the Corporate Finance Institute.